what all the people in the streets want, why millions of people were in the streets to protest something, what kind of a world they want to reach, and what social democracy has to learn from this moment.
Okay, well, I mean, it is definitely interesting that we've had large social movements in a variety of different democracies in the last couple of years, right? So we've had people out on the streets in Turkey, people out on the streets in the United States, people out on the streets in parts of Latin America, Chile perhaps most notably. Now, these are all democratic countries. So it's not so much that they're protesting for democracy, because these are ostensibly democratic countries, but what they share, right, is a sense that their democratic systems are not working well. They're not producing the outcomes that these people, at least out on the streets, want, and that somehow the systems are rigged in favor of certain privileged groups. And the specifics vary, right? So in the United States, the primary motivation for the Occupy Wall Street movement was increasing economic inequality and a sense that many people don't have the opportunities to participate in the economy and society the way previous generations did. In places like Turkey, it's a sense that the government is increasingly autocratic, perhaps, and unresponsive. And in Chile, also similarly, right, the sense is that the government is not fully responding to the demands of ordinary citizens. And so I think what's important to note, right, is that there's a lot of underlying anger, frustration, and dissatisfaction. Generally, though, social movements, that is to say, people out on the streets without a lot of organization, without ties to political institutions, these kinds of movements are very good at getting issues raised. They're very good at making clear that there's a lot of underlying dissatisfaction. They tend not to be by themselves very good at actually getting things done. That is to say, they're more effective as a negative rather than as a positive political movement. So I think for established political parties or institutions, social democratic ones in particular, the thing to learn from this kind of outbreak of social protest and social movement is that there's a lot of people very unhappy with the status quo. But in order for that to change, right, more organized, more structured political parties need to be able to kind of take up these demands and concerns and turn them into actual policy outcomes, turn them into actual governmental change, because people out on the street can't do that. And if they can't connect to organize political movements that can, what tends to happen is you just get more and more expressions of frustration, right, without some kind of outlet. And those can really spiral to, quite problematic kinds of outcomes, right? So people out on the street without people in government or people in power responding to them tends to create more chaos than it does actual positive change.
As we have seen in the last decade, social democracy was the pioneer to bring this social demands into a decision-making mechanism. Let's say 100 years ago, the social demand was equal gender equality and equal citizenship. It was also labor rights. Social democracy has evolved according to the need of different periods. Then after Second World War, it evolved according to the needs in Africa, like decolonization. During decolonization process, most of social democratic parties supported anti-decolonization process. Now, can we say that we entered into a new period in which there are now new demands like ecological demands, still gender equality demands, minority rights demands, things like that. So, what do you think the priority of new priorities of social democracy has to be according to the needs of our 21st century?
So, as you said, sort of social democracy grew in the late 19th century out of a larger movement, socialism, that was negative towards capitalism, and often ambivalent towards democracy. And social democracy grew out of that movement, right? And both embraced democracy and accepted capitalism, and tried within those parameters to improve the lives of ordinary people. So in the late 19th century, that meant full democratization, because most of Europe was not democratic at that time. It meant basic civil and economic rights, sort of very early versions of social policy, freedom of the press, freedom of association, those kinds of things. And over time, social democracy has sort of remained within those parameters, but changed as the challenges of the time have changed. So it moved from demanding full democracy and certain social, civil, and economic rights for ordinary citizens to, after the post-war period, right, championing some way to kind of bring the benefits of democracy and capitalism to people who in the early 20th century had largely been shut out of the fruits of those systems, right? So after 1945 in Europe, social democrats became those who tried to build up welfare states, expand democracy, democratize society in ways that would make everyone feel that the system was working for them and not just for some smaller sector of society. And to make capitalism not only much more efficient and effective, but a system, again, that didn't exclude and that could provide basic material benefits and hopefully equality of opportunity for everyone, right? But as sort of the world has changed in the late 19th century, right, social democracy has to change with it. So the basic task, right, of kind of keeping democracy and capitalism working together, of assuring that the benefits of both systems, right, seeped down to all sectors of society and not just some portion of them, right? That goal, right, that particular niche or that particular task of social democracy, I think, has remained, right? It is the movement that has seen itself, that has acted as, again, that movement or ideology that tries to reconcile democracy and capitalism and spread its benefits as widely as possible. But again, as capitalism has changed and as democracy has changed, social democracy has had to change. So the challenges, the specific challenges today in Europe, in Turkey, and elsewhere are somewhat different. So we have ecological challenges now. We have more demands for gender equality, since we now have basic civil rights and political rights in many of these countries. The demands are now for opening up those rights to other excluded groups, whether it's women or minorities, to making sure, again, that the democratic system, even though its formal rules are in place, actually works to respond to the demands of all different kinds of citizens. And again, making sure that capitalism not just produces lots of material wealth, but that material wealth, right, is not just shared among society, but that all sectors, all citizens, right, have equal opportunities to participate in that process. And so we see, again, as the world changes, right, political movements, social democracy included, have to kind of catch up and adjust. And sometimes they do that very well. And then sometimes there's a time lag, right? So in the past, right, we saw during the interwar period in Europe, for example, that this was a period of immense change and immense challenges. And some movements were able to respond and others did not. Those that responded did better, and those that did not were punished and oftentimes disappeared. So in Europe, for example, during the interwar period, liberal movements were very unsuccessful in responding to challenges and lost power in almost all countries, in many cases disappearing from politics entirely. We're obviously now in a period of immense change when there's lots of people out on the streets expressing their dissatisfaction. And those parties that don't respond successfully, that don't change their programs, that don't change their appeals are going to be severely punished. But this is an opportunity for social democracy to kind of renew itself as being at the forefront of responding to the challenges that average citizens actually face, right? And those are still economic challenges and political challenges, but also new ones about the environment, about gender equality, about making sure citizens with different backgrounds are all included in the political process, in society and in the economy. So it's definitely a time of challenge for social democracy, but also a time of opportunity because people are looking for solutions that they're clearly not finding in other established movements. I guess there's two things to discuss, right? One is whether we are in a post-ideological age and whether social democracy is an ideology or more of a pragmatic movement. There was a lot of talk, of course, after the Second World War that sort of ideologies were dead because people had learned that ideologies were dangerous and they could motivate people to do very dangerous things. And utopianism was something to be avoided because, again, it created a mentality where the means justified the ends, right? So you could do almost anything in order to justify this idea that you were creating a better world. And that was a very violent and very problematic kind of set of ideas. And certainly with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism, which was kind of the last great ideological challenge in the West, you got this further sense that we were now in a post-ideological period, at least in the West. I think that's less true in other parts of the world where people are still trying to figure out some fundamental questions about how they want their polities and their economies and their societies organized. And when those basic questions are still up for grabs, ideologies are powerful and important because they give people ways of trying to conceptualize the world that they want. So I think that ideologies may be less powerful in the great grand sense of ideologies in the West, but they're still quite powerful, as we can see in other parts of the world today, where people are really motivated to engage in sort of revolutionary transformations of their worlds. But there's something good about less ideological times, but also something bad. The good is that if people basically accept the rules of the game, but they want to improve them, so they agree democracy is good, capitalism is good, but they're not functioning as well as we'd like, then you tend to have politics that are less violent, that are less chaotic, that are less revolutionary. And that's probably a good thing. Fewer people die, fewer people suffer. But there's also a sense when you live in a time where people don't have great projects, where people don't have something that they believe in, where people don't feel that they have a way of creating a better world, that also can be very frustrating. And it can create a lot of political disillusionment, and it can create a lot of frustration, especially among young people. And again, one of the distinctive things about social democracy has always been that it's kind of combined both an ideological commitment to the creation of a better world with a strong sense of pragmatism, a strong sense that that better world must be created not by revolutionary upheaval, not by violent change, but by gradually improving the world in which we live in. And by firmly believing that gradual improvements over time can create a qualitatively better world. So I think that kind of approach to politics, firmly insisting that a better world can and should be the goal of political life, but also equally firmly insisting that that must be done within the parameters, especially of democracy, gradually, so that people have a chance to adapt and that you can test and see if your solutions are actually working, right? That this is still the correct way to go about politics, right? To always hope for a better world, not to say we can't do any better, not to say we can't improve the world, not to say that there is not a better place where we can all be, but to insist that one has to combine that, again, with a respect for the democratic rules of the game and an insistence that one must constantly test and make sure that what you are doing is actually working. And again, I think that's something that's distinctive to the social democratic movement, right? It doesn't have this kind of view that neoliberalism does, that this is the way the world is, and we can't really tinker with the realities of capitalism or democracy. It believes that we can and should improve both of those things. But it doesn't have the utopianism that I think is inherent in some previous ideologies, and that I also think is inherent in some social movements who truly believe, some of the participants in them seem to truly believe that you can radically change the world in a short period of time without kind of thinking very carefully about the steps that you'd want to take along the way to make sure that you're not just destroying the old, but actually creating something better. So that combination of kind of pragmatism and ideology, that's really, I think, the most successful way to approach politics. And I think that in the past, that's been really a hallmark of social democracy.
Can we assume that a world where social democracy will be the governing ideology or lifestyle, a culture? Can we say Pax Social Democratica is possible because you in your book on social democracy interwar area you are saying that social democrats they were the only ones who believed in peace. So you think a world in peace is possible with an enlargement of social democracy circle?
I think obviously a peaceful world is something most people aspire towards. I think the idea of a world, the world is more likely to be peaceful, obviously, when people are satisfied with their lives, right? When people don't feel that there's something dramatically wrong with their own life chances, dramatically wrong with the societies that they live in. That creates not only peace domestically, that is to say within countries' borders, but I think actually has a spillover effect to the international order, right? So much of the conflict between countries, right, is driven by fights over resources, fights over borders, fights over land, but also driven by societies that are fundamentally in ferment, right? Where it's very difficult for governments to make agreements, not just within their own countries, but with other countries as well. And so I think, for example, part of the post-war order in Europe saw a connection between changes in the domestic sphere and changes in the regional sphere that are very hard to separate out. So the desire of European countries after 1945 never to go to war again, that commitment was facilitated by changes that happened not only at the regional level, but changes that happened at the domestic level, the kinds of social democratic changes that we've talked a little bit about. And these things were supposed together, right? Societies were supposed to be more peaceful, more harmonious, and more compromise-oriented. And this would be naturally matched with a similar kind of dynamic at the regional level, right? That countries would be able to cooperate better, they'd be able to compromise, and they'd be able to solve their conflicts peacefully as opposed through violence. And I think that idea or that matching, right, makes sense not just in Europe after 1945, but overall, right? So if you live in a region where countries are in ferment, where there's a lot of dissatisfaction, I think that's likely to mean not only more violence and conflict at the domestic level, but more violence and conflict between states as well. And so I think the sort of social democratic agenda, by bringing, again, more peaceful and harmonious societies, will have important spillover effects to relationships between states as well. It can't solve every problem, but I think it would make a huge difference in the way states relate to each other and not just the way governments relate to their own citizens.
In the United States and social democrats in Europe, they can be unified under an umbrella, I don't know, an institution. Can they work more closely, and can Turkey be a part of this works? So what do you think the umbrella has to be for such an integration?
Well, I mean, that's definitely fairly far away. There are certainly, there's lots of cooperation, or at least some cooperation within Europe among social democratic parties, just like there's some cooperation within Europe among Christian democratic parties. There's some cooperation between Democrats in the US and center-left social democratic parties in Europe. It tends to be focused on very specific issues, sometimes things like union rights, trade issues, things like that. But the political spectrum in the United States is much further to the right than it is in most European countries. And so American Democrats tend to be far to the right, not only of their social democratic counterparts in Europe, but actually sometimes to their Christian democratic and other center-right parties in Europe. In other places, Turkey, for example, it's obviously easier for parties that share similar beliefs and share similar aspirations to cooperate. And so you could imagine that one of the things that could bring places like Turkey closer to Europe, right, is if there were parties within these different countries that could speak to each other much more easily. When we think back, for instance, to the late 20th century and the third wave of democracy, right, that brought countries like Spain and Portugal and Greece into Europe, right, transitioned them from dictatorship to democracy, and then into the European Union. Very strong ties existed before the transition and after between social democratic parties in Western Europe and incipient or underground social democratic parties in these countries. And so before the transition, social democratic parties in Western Europe were giving aid, not just material aid, but advice and support to social democrats in these countries. And then after the transition, cooperated with them, again, to help facilitate the building of new political parties and new political economies. And that was actually a very important part of making those transitions successful. The fact that political actors in these Southern European countries had partners in other countries that they could learn from and gain resources and advice from. And you can imagine that happening in other places, in Turkey, in parts of the former Soviet Union, some of the Eastern European countries that have come into Europe, some of the Eastern European countries that aspire to be parts of Europe, that building these kinds of connections makes everything work better, not only within the countries themselves, but it makes building a more successful and maybe even potentially social democratic Europe a more reasonable possibility.
To that direction, the Middle East, Africa, do you think it can be a good step for these countries?
Well, I mean, the version of social democracy that we know today grew out of some fairly specific conditions in Europe. And I think that is an important kind of background. Those are important roots, right? These were countries that had already fought certain, or were in the midst, actually, in some cases, of fighting conflicts with religious movements and religious authorities, and were fighting for democracy and for more equitable versions of capitalism. So I think the European version of social democracy has some characteristics that are very much, that it is very much stamped by the European experience, which is the European experience and not necessarily the same experience other parts of the world have had. That said, social democracy, as we've discussed, has some very distinctive qualities, right? It is the movement that in the West has historically been associated with demands for greater justice and equality, that has tolerated and accepted capitalism, but insisted again that it spread its benefits to all sectors of society. It's the force that has been very conscious of the need to maintain and nurture social stability and to expand democracy as well. And I think these are goals that are not region specific, that are not historically specific, that appeal to people in a wide variety of places and contexts. And insofar as a movement can promise, right, an open and well-functioning democracy, an opening and well-functioning capitalist economy, and a government that's committed to spreading the benefits of both of those systems to as wide a number of citizens as possible, I can't imagine that that's not an attractive message to people in all different parts of the world. The question is, right, whether there are movements that can actually do that. And social democracy has definitely been one that's tried to offer that separate from religion, right? So it's not necessarily anti-religious, but it insists that religion belongs not in the political sphere, but in the private sphere. And so the desire to create these other kinds of social qualities, again, justice, equality, open political and economic system. These are things, again, that social democrats, sort of stand for, and I think transcend the original context or conditions that it evolved out of.